Jesus was a disappointment. I'm not bending the truth. I'm not changing the truth. I am taking text that we see in the Bible, and we can conclude wholeheartedly that Jesus was a disappointment. Jesus was an incredible disappointment to the religious leaders, to the religious elite, because time and time again, Jesus failed to live up to the legalistic standard that they had set for the people. Jesus isn't a disappointment to me. He's not a disappointment to the billions of people that follow him, but we cannot get away from the truth that when Jesus walked the earth, there were those who found him a huge disappointment. The religious leaders had hoped that he would come and back them to the hill for all of the things that they'd put in place, and yet we see time and time again encounters where Jesus stands against the laws that they have imposed on the people and kept at his heart those commandments that God had given him. If you want to kind of back me on this, I would draw a final line under my statement that Jesus was a disappointment in that the Pharisees and the religious leaders at the time decided the only way to get around the problem of Jesus was to kill him. I would suggest they weren't best pleased with him when that is your baseline conclusion. And this week, those of you who have been following along with us on the Bible plans would have seen an encounter just like this. Because you had this moment where Jesus comes along and he's going to tell the dirty sinners how wonderful these religious leaders are, how much they've got it right. And they would have agreed with him. Because Jesus would have said things like, those people who do not seek God earnestly, who don't honor him with their actions. But then he said things like, those people who value sacrifice over a broken heart. Jesus said things that they wouldn't have liked, because they needed the sacrifices, because the sacrifices paid for their flowing robes and kept the temple tidy. They needed people to need them. You know what? As we begin this morning, I am incredibly overjoyed that Jesus disappointed this part of society. Because I'm not sure I would have followed someone who lived up to the expectations of the religious leaders of his time. And we're going to unpack that a little bit this morning. So if you have a Bible with you, can I encourage you to turn to Matthew 12, and I'm going to invite Jude to come forward this morning and read for us. Thank you, Jude.
At that time, Jesus was going through the cornfields on the Sabbath, and his disciples, feeling hungry, began to pluck the ears of corn and eat them. When the Pharisees saw this, they said to him, "Look, your disciples are doing what is forbidden on the Sabbath." And he answered, "Have you not read what David did when he and his men were hungry? He went into the house of God and ate the sacred bread, though neither he nor his men had a right to eat it, but only the priests. Or have you not read in the law that on the Sabbath the priests in the temple break the Sabbath? Are they not held to be guilty? But I tell you, there is something greater than the temple. If you had known what this text means, it is mercy I require, not sacrifice. You would not have condemned the innocent, for the Son of Man is Lord of the Sabbath." He went on to another place and entered their synagogue. A man was there with a withered arm, and they asked Jesus, "Is it permitted to heal on the Sabbath?" They wanted to bring a charge against him, but he said to them, "Suppose you had one sheep fell into a ditch on the Sabbath. Is there a single one of you who would not catch hold of it and lift it out? Surely a man is worth far more than a sheep. It is therefore permitted to do good on the Sabbath." Then he said to the man, "Stretch out your arm." He stretched it out, and it was made sand again like the other. But the Pharisees, on leaving the synagogue, plotted to bring about Jesus' death.
I want to ask you a very simple question. Hands up who's played Uno. Yeah, I have Uno here. Fortunately, the church has a pack of Uno because I don't have Uno. Apparently, it's a game everyone knows, but I don't. Just show your hands again if you've played Uno. Okay, super simple game. The idea of the game, I'm not going to do a card trick, is that you have cards. On them are numbers with colours, and it's a bit like Snap. On your go, you need to place a card on top of the card that's already down that matches the colour, or matches the number, or matches the symbol. There's some symbols like reverse and all sorts of things like that. So you've got a reverse one in green. The idea is really simple. You just basically play your cards on and on and on and on and on until eventually, there we are, someone will play something like a +2. Anyone tell me what a +2 does? Next person has to pick up 2. I should have really set the pack up before I came here to find a +4. I mean, I know how one that doesn't have a +4 in it. Clearly a really pleasant game for anyone who's played. If you don't have a +4, it's going to be far less conflicting. Okay, a wild one, that's what it is on this one. But then you have these +4 cards. Anyone tell me what these do? Pick up 4. Now, Uno falls into 2 very, very set camps of people. So I'm going to need you to be honest with me, I'm going to need you to show your hands. Okay, scenario 1. If someone plays a +4 card, the next person has to pick up 4, irrelevant of what's in their hand. The +4 card is like a full stop. The next go is the person picks up 4. Hands up if you played that variation. Okay. Scenario 2. Someone plays a +4 card, and the next person can play a +4 card on top of it, and therefore the person after is now on +8, unless they have a +4 card, and then the poor person after them is on +12. And I won't go any further because maths isn't my strong point, but we get the gist. Who plays that variation? Okay. No, I don't want to be that guy, but you're wrong. Group 1, congratulations, give yourself a round of applause, you are playing the official rules. So much so that Uno took to social media to tell you cannot stack cards on top of cards. I didn't realise the draw 2 card was involved in this, we're going to get into that. But you cannot place a +4 on top of a +4. A +4 ends the go. So congratulations to those of you who are correct. Those of you who are wrong, hold your heads in shame. But it's funny, isn't it, how legalism can slip into such a simple game. Surely what's more important isn't which variation you are playing, but that all of you are on the same page when you start the game. That you know what is going to happen. But now this afternoon you can go home and play a pleasant game of Uno knowing the correct. In the parable, or sorry, in the encounter we just read, Jesus comes across these Pharisees. And in that encounter, he is met with legalism, with a line in which they believe there is a right and a wrong. The legalistic rules the Pharisees and scribes had put in place were what were now in question in the encounter that we've read. They know the rules, they know the legal lingo, and yet Jesus confronts the legalism they have, not with other legalism, but with faith. Jesus creates a question of faith in that encounter that we see and we read about. So I just want to break it down a little bit, because it wasn't the passage I felt most led to at the start of the week, but it just nagged at me that this was an important thing for us to understand. So to begin with, I want us to look at the words of theologian Charles Rye. He defines legalism as this, and this is really important for us as we move forward. Legalism is a fleshy attitude which conforms to a code for the purpose of exalting self. That's what legalism does. Those of you who are very chuffed that you play the right rules for Uno, you're being legalistic, I know. But legalism is defined as a fleshy attitude which conforms to a code for the purpose of exalting self. The Pharisees come at Jesus and his disciples with a legal argument. That's what they are doing here. Look at your disciples doing what is unlawful on the Sabbath. Legalism. That's what they're coming with. So how did we get to Jesus' disciples breaking the laws of God? So that's what we're assuming the Pharisees are challenging them with. They are breaking the laws of God. But did they? Exodus puts it like this. Exodus 20 says, remember the Sabbath day by keeping it holy. 6 days you shall labor and do all your work, but on the 7th day is the Sabbath, to the Lord your God. On it you shall not do any work, neither you nor your sons or daughters, nor your males or female servants, nor your animals, nor your any foreigners residing in your towns. That's the law that God laid out for his people. We don't really see the disciples breaking any of this in what they are doing. The problem is they are breaking some laws, and we can't deny that. Because as Jewish history unfolded, we see time and time again that the Pharisees added new laws to the laws that God had laid out before them. In fact, just around the Sabbath day, there were 2 whole treaties written by Pharisees to understand how better to protect it. One of them added 39 acts which recalled as an individual to break the Sabbath law. What I found fascinating the more I read on this is once you broke down those 39, and that's only one of the treaties, you ended up with hundreds of additional subpoints onto the law. Hundreds of subpoints onto a law which at its very core was God telling people to chill out a little bit. It's not all about them, and come into his presence. And yet the Pharisees has added so many things to it, all these extra man-made laws to this simple act of Sabbath, that many believe that the Sabbath day became the most stressful day of the week for the people. The day that God had set apart for rest and to be in his presence had quickly become the most stressful day of the week, for people feared that they had done too much, that they'd walked too far, that they'd helped someone too much. That was how they lived their Sabbath day, because of the rules put down by man. That's what Jesus is challenging in this encounter. So we know that the disciples, broke some of the man-made laws. We know they've done that. There is laws against what they've done. They didn't break any biblical laws. In regards to the Sabbath, they were clean. Now, some of you may push back, were they stealing? It's a valid question. It wasn't their field. But in Deuteronomy 23, we read this, that you could pluck with your hand the grain, but you could not take a sickle to it. So it was understood that if someone walked through the field, they could take with their hands the grain, and they were breaking no biblical laws. As far as God was concerned, nothing the disciples did that morning, the devotion this morning, broke any laws. And yet the Pharisees come at them hard and fast. So Jesus and the disciples are confronted by these religious leaders. They want Jesus in this moment to defend their laws. This is bigger than just the Sabbath now. Jesus is about to back them or stand against them on everything they have got the people doing. A question of legalism versus a question of faith. This moment is the foundation of everything that's to come in this encounter. And it's a key moment where we begin to understand that Jesus will time and time again disappoint the religious leaders and religious folk for generations to come. Just as a side note, and I don't know if you read the Bible like this, but I read a collection of commentaries on this passage, and every single one comes to one final point. It is a bit weird. It's a bit of a weird encounter that Jesus and his disciples are walking together, not weird. They're walking through a field, not particularly weird. The Pharisees are following them close enough to spot that as they're walking, their hand is down by their side, taking the grain. I'm almost positive they weren't there to hear Jesus' wisdom. Already we see the Pharisees' only objective in this is to get Jesus to a point where he will back them or stand against them. This whole thing has almost been set up by the Pharisees in the assumption that they will capture Jesus in this moment, or they will have his backing for all that they stand for. The truth is, we know as we read through the text, they were there to catch him out. We can well imagine they were there with their rule book under their arms, looking for a reason to accuse him or to have him validate them. The sad thing is, the more that you read over this passage, the more that you realize this became very little about God and a whole lot about were they right. That's what they wanted in this moment. They wanted to know that they were right. Legalism, a fleshy attitude which conforms to a code for the purpose of exalting self. We understand at this moment that the Pharisees are living out a lost heart of discipleship. No longer are they following Jesus, but instead they are caught observing religious law. Please hear me, I'm not telling you to break the Ten Commandments, but we need to understand the Pharisees are not arguing about those. They are arguing their own stances. The scene is set. Hopefully you have a little bit more understanding about the undercurrent of what's happening between this encounter, between what we are seeing from Jesus and the Pharisees. And as we close this final section, we see Jesus doesn't agree that the disciples are breaking the law. Instead, he challenges directly back. If you had known what these words mean, I don't desire mercy nor sacrifice, you would not have condemned the innocent. Read the other way around, you are condemning the innocent because you have put sacrifice above mercy. You are more worried about your laws and how you look than faithfulness to God. You are more worried about how it appears than about the heart of the matter. Jesus is speaking directly at them and challenging them. It creates a difficult question for us sat here this morning and stood here before you. Are we so caught up in the legalism of all that we have before us, we've forgotten to be faithful? Have we lost being faithful for the sake of legalism? Are we so afraid to make a mistake that we've forgotten Jesus himself tells us, I have come to give life and life to the fullest? Life and life to the fullest does not sound like the Sabbath that was created for the people at this time. And yet that's what Jesus comes and promises. We then read, as this passage goes on, of this encounter again that Jesus has. He's now in the Pharisees' home. He's come back to the temple. He is there, present before them. He's on their ground. Again, many would say that this was a very deliberate movement by Jesus to take almost this battle to them, to say, you know what, this is the moment we're going to break this. So he's come before them. And we read that in this moment, a man with a shriveled hand is there, and the Pharisees are looking to trip Jesus up. Looking for a reason to bring charges against Jesus, they asked him, is it lawful to heal on the Sabbath? This is an incredibly clever question. This is a question that will leave Jesus needing to do one of two things: agree with them or disagree with them. Both are incredibly dangerous. And they are just waiting. They are waiting because if he disagrees with them, then they will be able to come against him. And if he agrees with them, he is validating everything that they have put in place. Again, they are looking for validation of what they are saying. But Jesus, being Jesus, doesn't answer the question at all. Those of you that have read it would have seen. Instead, he responds to their question with a question. He said to them, if any of you has a sheep and it falls into a pit on the Sabbath, will you not take hold of it and lift it out? They ask him a question. Jesus responds with a question. If any of you has a sheep and it falls into a pit on the Sabbath, will you not take hold of it and lift it out? This is an incredible question in this moment because there was no one present who would leave a sheep bleating in a ditch all day. Now, we could argue that was compassion, or we could argue for anyone who's ever been with sheep when they bleat, it would just be plain annoying to put up with that for 24 hours. But the truth is this: no one with a compassionate heart would leave a sheep to suffer for the whole day, waiting for the clock to tick so that they could rescue it once the Sabbath had come to an end. In fact, it was lawful to rescue a sheep on the Sabbath from a pit, so long as it wasn't for the purpose of profit. The Pharisees put in place that it was okay to save the sheep based on compassion. For the animal, this was a life. So Jesus asked them, if a sheep falls into a pit, would you not save it? Would you not rescue it? Would you leave it to suffer all day? The Pharisees knew at this point, there's no denying that they were in trouble. Because now they needed to answer a question. If they were to say yes, they've now just put themselves in a bind that it's okay to do good on the Sabbath. And if they say no, they are going against some of their own structure of laws. But Jesus presses the point on. How much more valuable is a person than a sheep? Therefore, it is lawful to do good on the Sabbath. How much more valuable is a person than a sheep? Therefore, it is lawful to do good on the Sabbath. The Pharisees have come at Jesus wanting him to back them. And instead he asked them a question. No one in their right mind would leave a sheep all day. So surely, if a person is more valuable than a sheep, it is lawful to do good on the Sabbath. In the world of chess, we would find ourselves in check. There is no coming back from this for the religious leaders. They need to say a sheep is more valuable than a human to be right. They are well and truly in a bind. So it creates the question, if someone who was able to heal someone came across a man with a withered hand on the Sabbath, would it be right for them to heal? That's what all of this boils down to. These two encounters boil down to this very deliberate question. If someone who was able to heal a man with a withered hand encountered him on the Sabbath, would it be right for them to heal? That's where we find ourselves at this moment. Stood face to face, we have on one side the educated interpreters of the law. On the other side, we have Jesus, the Son of God, and his understanding of the law. The Pharisees would have claimed higher ground because of all that they knew, because they were trained experts. And Jesus stood claiming to be Lord of the Sabbath. Stay there. Both parties held in complete check. At the moment, we are word against word. People would draw their own conclusions depending on who they favoured in this argument, until Jesus does the thing that Jesus does time and time and time and time again throughout the Gospels. Jesus puts theology into practice. Jesus takes theory and argument and lives it out amongst the people. This is such an important moment in the Gospels for us, because Jesus didn't just simply come to tell us what to do. Jesus lived it out. Jesus lived out the words. He became the example of thy kingdom come on earth as it is in heaven. You know what? Theory is great. Theory is great. Knowing lots about God is awesome. But it does not beat knowing God personally. Theory is great. Knowing what is good and knowing what to do is good. But it doesn't actually beat doing it. It sounds fairly simple, doesn't it? But we all know what's right to do, but the number of us that will still do the wrong thing or do nothing is fairly high. So it's all very well knowing what is good, but actually doing it is more important. Then he said to the man, stretch out your hand. So he stretched it out, and it was completely restored, just as sound as the other. Two arguments stood face to face, word against word, until Jesus puts theory into action. Then he said to the man, stretch out your hand. So he stretched it out, and it was completely restored, just as sound as the other. Check had moved to checkmate. The Lord of the Sabbath has just changed the entire understanding of the game at this point. This is hugely significant in Jesus' ministry. Hugely significant in Jesus' ministry. Because no longer was it about walking on eggshells to avoid making mistakes. We were now beginning to move into a realm where it was about following Jesus. It was about following what Jesus was calling us to do, beginning to understand this idea of living life and life to its fullest. This would be one of those moments where we would be incredibly overjoyed, we would jump about, we would clap our hands. I'm fairly sure there were people present who were pretty chuffed that the Pharisees had been brought down a peg or two. I wonder if deep down this also makes us a little bit uncomfortable. I wonder if deep down this moment and this encounter makes us a little bit uncomfortable, because for many of us, whether we like to admit it or not, we do quite like the legalistic side of things. It just keeps everything in order. I know how good you are by how often you're here on a Sunday morning. So if you've not been for a few weeks, you are low on the level of legalism standards. We like to know how often people are praying. I want to ask you, how up to date are you on your Bible reading plan? Because it's a great way for me to gauge your faithfulness. We don't really like talking about it, but deep down we are people who base a lot of life on legalism. And we base our faith on the same thing. We are dangerously close at times to judging people by that standard the Pharisees had set. So this whole encounter, whilst incredible, and lays the foundation for two things. One, the way Jesus will live his life, and the way he will die. That is decided in this encounter. But deep down, it's uncomfortable for us because we cannot depend on the mechanisms and the gauges we use in life to look at faithfulness. Too often we like our rules and we like to sit in the seat of the Pharisees and cast down judgment. Look at them turning up late. Missed another meeting. Never get dressed up properly for church. Took 2 biscuits. Rumour has it they're a week behind their reading plan. We heard they went to the pub this week. There is so many things that we may choose stand against someone. God laid out 10 commandments, one of which was about observing the Sabbath. Somehow, the Pharisees heard that. They made 2 treatises on it, one of which contained 39 additional laws, of which had 100 subpoints, and yet there was one at the beginning. It is important we do not fall into the trap of adding the pressure to people by putting our own expectations on them, when it is based on relationship with God at its heart. The whole Sabbath was designed around spending time in God's presence, and it had become anything but that because of the man-made laws added to it. And Jesus strips it all away. Strips it all away. Takes away all of that expectation to conform to the standards of man, and instead makes it all about a relationship with him. The truth is this, as I close, by protecting their laws, the Pharisees would rather a man suffer than encounter the full life Jesus offers. And we need to be incredibly careful which side of that line we stand in our day-to-day lives. I want us to ask this question as I close. Is being right more important than someone seeing the love God has for them in his eyes? Is being right in your own eyes more important than someone seeing the love God has for them in his eyes?